Hi there, welcome to the fifth part of the God vs. Wealth series. In the first 4 videos I've discussed why I'm convinced that Christians should be rich, and now I'm gonna turn to some counter arguments towards that thesis. I'm gonna start with a common counter argument which I've already discussed in the previous videos a bit. It's the theory that it's no problem with being rich as long as you value God more than your money, as long as you don't worship your money, as long as you are a master and not a slave to your wealth. You know, it's not a problem with owning money. The problem is if money owns you, and so on. This argument is common, but it's wrong because it actually contradicts the teachings of Jesus, which of course is not so good. In his Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew 6, verse 19 and forward, he says, "Do not store up for yourself treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moth and rust do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Now, the theory that says that it's no problem with being rich as long as you value your money less than God, they're basically saying that you can store up treasures on earth and have your heart in heaven. But what Jesus is saying here is where your treasure is, your heart will be also. You know, it's not possible to have a treasure on earth and your heart in heaven. In order to get your heart in heaven, in order to have full devotion to God, you need to store up a treasure in heaven instead of on earth. And this word treasure in Greek, thesaros, is a word that is commonly used for wealth in the scriptures. For example, in James chapter 5, which we read in the first video I posted, this word is used when James is criticizing the rich. He says, "You have stored up treasures in the last days." So Jesus is saying here that we shouldn't store up wealth on earth, but in heaven instead. Of course, this is a very problematic text for people who argue that Christian can be rich, because it's basically crushing their arguments into dust. And then there's another problem with this theory, which I also mentioned in previous videos, and that is that the poor need your money no matter how you value your money or how they affect your relationship with God. Of course, I'm not saying that it's good to have a bad relationship with God. On the contrary, I'm actually arguing that if you have a lot of money, you will automatically get a bad relationship with God. In order to have your heart in heaven, have a fully passionate devotion to God, you need to get rid of your wealth. But then the thing is also that there's a huge amount of poor people that need our help. 200 million people are affected by natural disasters every year. 1 billion people live in extreme poverty. There are huge needs out there. And as long as we have money to help them, we are obliged to do that. We cannot just say, well, my money doesn't affect my relationship with God, so I can keep it. Because, first of all, it's not true. And secondly, the poor needs the money anyway. So that was the first theory I wanted to crush. And the second one is quite similar. It is basically saying that it's no problem with being rich as long as you aren't greedy. And the problem is greed and not the amount of money. People that argue for this thesis often say that there are poor, greedy persons and there are rich, generous persons. So we shouldn't focus on the amount of money. We should focus on whether there's greed or not. And of course, I agree with that. Greed is a problem. In fact, Ephesians 5 that says that greed is idolatry. So there's a huge problem with greed. However, I argue that if a rich person is truly generous, he or she won't be rich for so much long. You know? Because then that person will give so much away that he or she only has the most needful thing left, you know. When we talk about generosity, what we should focus on is not how much money we give, but how much money we have left. Jesus is actually teaching about this in Mark chapter 12, verse 41 and forward. It says, Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins, worth only a fraction of a penny. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, I tell you the truth, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she out of her poverty put in everything, all she had to live on. So Jesus is arguing that we should look at the percentage in our offerings, how much does this offering represent of my total belongings, and secondly, Jesus is also saying that we should look at how much money people have left. So that was we should look at when we talk about generosity and greed. And I argue when people have more than they need, when they spend money on jacuzzis and PlayStations and whatever, while there are people starving to death, I think that they really are greedy. And I also think it's a bit problematic to talk about the poor as greedy. Again, if you are starving to death, if you are suffering from diseases or malnutrition, oppression and other things that poverty causes, I wouldn't say that you are greedy if you want to get rid of that. So I think it's a bit shameful for rich people to start kicking on the poor to defend their own wealth. And then finally, the third heresy is discussing equality and criticizing equality. It is a common counter-argument against equality, and it basically says that if rich people that have a lot of money manage them well and create investments and jobs and do good things, create growth, and then people can get out of poverty, and there's really not a problem, and many people actually argue that this is what most rich people do. They have a lot of money and they have big corporations and they make investments and create growth, and so the economy thrives and everyone will benefit out of it, and so on. And this argument is often used outside the church as well, but when it's used among Christians, it's surprisingly common, I would say, that people use Matthew 25 as an argument for this, the parable of the talents. And I say surprisingly because I really don't think that people have thought about this seriously when they argue that the parable of the talents have a literal meaning, and that the talents represent money, and what Jesus here is teaching is that you could and should make investments as Christians. If I don't want to read it all because it takes so much time, but it's basically a parable where a man goes away from his home and leaves money to his servants, and some makes huge investments and makes profits, and there's another guy who just digs his coin into the ground and does nothing. And when the man comes back, he rewards those who have made huge profits, and the man who didn't do anything at all is punished. So his coin is given to the richest guy, and then it says in the last verse 30, Matthew 25, the man says, "Throw that worthless servant outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." So if we would take this parable literally, or at least say that the talents represent money, we would have to argue that poor people go to hell, and that people who don't make investments go to hell. And the way that we gain salvation is through investments and profits. This is quite an absurd example of a very capitalist neoliberal soteriology and the doctrine of salvation. Well, we are basically saying that investments are needed for salvation, because this parable, of course, is about when Jesus comes back, when we look at the context, his second coming. And if we would take this literally, we would say that when Jesus comes back, he will look at if we've made huge investments, and if we haven't, we will go to hell. Of course, that's a bit problematic. In the parable before, Jesus talks about some virgins. Some of them have oil for their lamps, some of them haven't when the bridegroom comes back, and those who haven't, they can't participate in the wedding banquet. So if we take that literally, it would mean that all Christians, virgins, need to have oil when Jesus comes back. And that's a bit absurd interpretation. A more reasonable interpretation is that both the oil and the talents represent things like spiritual gifts, evangelism, fruits for the kingdom of God, helping the poor, serving other people, and that we should bear fruit and do good deeds and spread the kingdom of God, and not just hide it in the ground and put it away. We should have we should grow in the kingdom and spread it on to other people. Thinking that you need investments to get saved is quite dangerous theology. So I believe this parable can be used as an argument for inequality, and there's also another great problem with this inequality theory, and that is, of course, that poor didn't choose inequality. We all know that the richest people in the world are white men. And the people that live in extreme poverty and moderate poverty around the world, billions of people, they didn't go to an election and say, well, you know, those white Americans and Europeans, they look so wise and they have so good education, so, you know, they can take most of the money, they can take 80% of the world's income, and we can just have 1%, you know, we don't need so much, we can starve to death if we want to. They didn't do that, you know. When we're defending this inequality, we're basically using the same argument that was used before in Europe for authoritarian regimes, where we say that it's the wise, good people that can manage power that should have it. And, you know, and everyone else is just, relax and let them do the decisions. So it's basically an undemocratic argument. It's one thing if your neighbor comes to you and say, hey, come on, have this $100 bill and do whatever you want with it. You know, that's one thing, but many of the rich people in the world have gained their money not in a way that the poor encourage and authorize, you know. So equality is what we should strive for, because that's fair, that's just, and that's reasonable. And that's, of course, also what the Bible teaches, which I explain in the second video in this series. So that was the three heresies that I wanted to mention now, and as you probably noticed, these are a bit more theoretical arguments, not bound to a specific Bible text. But of course, there are also many counter-arguments that use different Bible passages and Bible verses against the theory that Christians should be rich. And in the coming videos, I will discuss some of them. The next video will look at probably one of the most common counter-arguments against the Christian can be rich, which is basically pointing to that there were rich people in the Old Testament. You know, some of our fathers, spiritual fathers and mothers in the Jewish faith, had a lot of money. So we will look at that in the next video. I hope you see it as well, and thanks for watching. God bless you.